All right, here we are for the podcast Workers' Compensation Comp Law. I'm joined today by Professor Duff from the St. Louis University. He is the director of the Weffel Labor and Employment Law Department at St. Louis University. He's been at that school for about 3 years, and previously he was at the University of Wyoming Law School for 16 years. Professor Duff's sort of unique, in my opinion, because I don't think anybody else out there is teaching workers' compensation at a law school level with any degree of consistency. I think various schools sort of dive in and go for a semester here, a semester there. Dave Torrey certainly had a good run at Pitt, but I just don't see it. And I really lament the fact that we're not providing our little corner of the world to these students. So thank you for joining me today. We're going to talk about the gig economy, and the sort of the stimulus for that was you had made a comment on LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago that really caught my attention and my focus, because the gig economy has been sort of troubling to me intellectually. So um, is it a substitute for a substitute? Are we excluding people that we shouldn't be? What's the real scope of this?
Well, I think the way that it's been constructed, I think originally, if I think about what the first time I ever heard the term gig economy, who was I thinking about? And I always pick on my poor brother-in-law, who was a coder and is now a kind of a bigwig at Google now. But this guy would go into a corner with a some kind of a handheld computer device, and there was nobody controlling his work, I can tell you, and he was doing things that we wouldn't ordinarily think of as being worker like. Now I'm not sure what I mean by that, but he was kind of off on his own doing something, and I think originally that was sort of the idea of the gig economy, that there were certain types of work that were so unique, so unusual, and so often very technological, that it almost didn't make sense to talk about an employer being in control of the work of the employee, right? And I think originally, when I sort of confronted that idea, I didn't have any difficulty with it. I mean, it made sense to me that whatever categories you set up, there were going to be these kind of in between categories, and yeah, it's not that you're not worried about dealing with work injuries. It's not as if you're not dealing or concerned about racism or sexism or anything that we apply labor and employment law to. It's just that you didn't think it was a big enough problem to spend the energy and the time analyzing whether this person was what we would call an employee or not an employee, right? So when I think of gig economy, I think originally that's what we meant. And then what winds up happening is we get sort of mashed up with the whole concept of an independent contractor, and real elaborate control analyses, like who's actually in control of this work, who has the right to control this work. And David, by the way, this comes up in my tort classes as well, because it's a different question in torts. The question is, the putative employee goes out on a drive and runs into a person who doesn't want to sue the agent slash employee. They would much rather sue the employer. And then the question is, well, is it an employer, right? And so it's a similar question. It's just from a slightly different tilt and a different perspective and a different body of law.
And you've got really good lawyers in both systems who are making these arguments, and they're making law that implicates each other. Um, and there's going to be some balance because of that.
I
Uh,
think that's right. And I think historically, what's frustrated both employees and employers, unions and employers, is the lack of predictability. Because, if you have a test that has 10 factors, right, you and I are going to be able to agree with many of the outcomes, if not most of the outcomes, right? But there are going to be cases that resist the relied easy classification. Like, well, in some respects, this person looks like an employee. In some respects, they look like a an independent contractor. And I don't know. I mean, that's frustrating and vexing, and people get upset about that and so forth. And maybe if you're an employer, you think it's not fair that I should be responsible for this putative employee, whatever body of law we're talking about, right? What I was really talking about, though, is when that sort of relatively simple model that we're talking about starts to expand, right? And so you look at somebody in a particular company, they have somebody deliver groceries home, right? And you say, well, I don't know, the person is getting their order from an app, right? And so is an employer actually directing the person what to do? He'd say, well, not necessarily. They're facilitated in their interactions with people who want to buy stuff from the grocery store by the app, right? But the person who operates the app says, well, I'm not a grocer. I'm an electronics company, right? I develop apps, and my business is getting customers and shoppers, people who do the physical shopping together. I'm just making that happen. Now the problem with that is, well, you know what the problem is. The problem is that person, let's assume, for the sake of argument, that is an independent contractor, and on their way to make the delivery, they fall and they get hurt. And then the question is simple. Well, who's gonna pay for that? And then a follow-on question is how many of these people are out there getting hurt like this, right? And
Yeah.
and 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 just to cut to the chase, I will tell you that I think that the gig economy, meaning the sum total of all these kind of alternative working arrangements that we're talking about, I think it is much, much bigger than people think it is. I think, and I'm doing some work on it now, and every time I look at it, it looks like it's getting bigger. And I don't want to be alarmist about it if that doesn't bear any relationship to empirical reality. But I see a lot of people saying, well, depending on how you define this, right? It's either 5% of the economy or 45% of the economy. It's like, well, wait a minute. That's a pretty big difference. And when you start getting into those outer reaches, then my question for students of workers' compensation is, well, how big does it have to get before we're really starting to play around with, if you will, the structure of work injury remedies? And are we taking, for example, preventative science into account if we think that the rate of injury is only the rate with respect to official formal employees, and we're leaving the informal economy out of the equation?
Yeah, I heard the argument made that these apps are just want ads. And the fellow that made the argument that they're just want ads then had to explain to the audience what the devil a want ad was,
Yeah,
because unfortunately there weren't enough old people in the room to remember sort of that paradigm.
yeah.
I thought that had some merit to it. But I tell you what really concerns me about what you just said is that time and again we talk about this race to the bottom, if you will, or this concept of shuffling liability onto the federal government, Medicare, Medicaid, these other systems. If we're not capturing the cost of these injuries, then we're not, in an accounting sense, passing that on to the customer that's using that service, and we're losing predictability. We're losing financial responsibility. And it seems to me that that's going to kill our predictability in much broader context in terms of economic evaluation and development. Is that a valid concern, or does it really just not matter?
Well, I think it is a valid concern depending on how large you think the gig economy is, right? There's a threshold empirical determination that really has to be made. I think it's one kind of problem if you're dealing with 5% of the economy or 7% of the economy. And many of the folks who look at Standard Bureau of Labor Statistics figures think that maybe this is an exaggerated concern. But I was recently looking at a Bank of Boston study from 2023, in which the authors of the study basically conclude that the way we've been tracking these folks is not accurate, and it's because of the way we survey people. And there's also very specific problems. Like, even if you think that the independent contractor is not covered by workers' comp, and they go out in their uncovered work, right, and they get hurt, and they're not covered by workers' comp, it's going to impact their ability to work on every job on which they are formally employees, right? So I think that it's a problem, and at a minimum, David, what I would say, I teach as you mentioned, a workers' compensation course here at St. Louis University School of Law, and we just finished up our spring semester. I usually teach it in the spring semester, and I'm constantly talking to them about risk pools. Like, whether you're on the right, whether you're on the left, I don't care where you are. The problem is that everybody has to have some kind of a tacit agreement about, or maybe not tacit, an explicit agreement about what the injury cost is. What I tell my students, both in workers' comp and torts law, is when somebody gets injured, somebody's going to pay for the cost of injury, right? And really what we're doing is we're figuring out who that should be. And we have policy rationales for why it should be the employer, why it should be the employee, why it should be third-party insurers, why it should be monopolistic insurers, whatever the structure is that you have in your mind. The problem is that you have to get enough of that injury paid for so that society can get on with its productive work. And if what you have is a huge amount of work injury expense, where you're either you think it's not being compensated and thus is falling on the injured person, right, and not on the industry writ large, or you're not sure. I think either problem is its own kind of problem. It's I don't. Sometimes I think it's even worse if we don't know one way or the other. We're just not sure. And every time I look at the gig economy, I'm surprised that there's not more agreement on its size. Although I've become pretty convinced that it's much bigger than the standard government statistics are reporting.
Yeah, and part of that complication, I've heard employers express the frustration that somebody may be an independent contractor under the federal tax code, and yet they're not an independent contractor for unemployment compensation in their state. And then the workers' comp question is a hard maybe. And
Right.
so you got three or four definitions, and they're struggling. To me, that's the predictability problem. How's someone supposed to do business? How's a union or an employee supposed to make valid agreements if we can't get the doggone definitions down? But we don't know what we're talking about, but we're going to agree on something. That doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, and if you go back to the going way back into the late 1950s into the 1960s, when we were starting to talk about pension law and employee benefit law, one of the big policy rationales. In fact, John F. Kennedy gave a speech on the floor of the Senate about this, disuniformity, just what you were just talking about. Like, how is an HR director in a Fortune 500 company supposed to determine what the benefits are going to be in Massachusetts versus Arkansas, right? It's very difficult for them to tell, and I think disuniformity is actually I'm not suggesting that people like to pay money, but at least when you know what the money is you'll be paying, you can plan, you can price accordingly. You can do all those things that we know you have to do to be in business. When you don't know, or when it's unclear, then I think you have a problem, and you also have splits within the classes, right? Because you have certain companies that are delivering, for lack of a better term, gig services, and then other companies who aren't, right? And so that race to the bottom problem becomes a real one because I'm at a competitive disadvantage. And oh yeah, by the way, since it seems like what we're going to attempt to do is reindustrialize. And one of the nightmare scenarios that I have, if you really don't have a clear definition of who is permissibly counted as a gig worker, what's to stop an expanding industrial base coupled with an expansion of the gig economy? Right? To me, that's worth worrying about.
And the race to the bottom, the big brains always talked about it being a state to state competition idea, but I'm seeing it in a micro sense. It's what you're just describing. It's a two companies in Orlando, Florida, one of which has got employees, one of which is running as a gig operation, and there's a comparative advantage right there in the same town in the same business. And
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right.
well, and so you're talking to your neighbor who works for a living doing exactly what you do, and he's covered by workers' comp, and you're not. I,
I think that's right. I think and I think that this idea, and again, it's one thing if what we're going to do is we're going to do a straight ahead restatement second section 222 of agency, 10 factors, let the chips fall where they may. That's one thing. It's another thing if a company simply says, look, I know that historically, this category of worker I've called employees, I'm calling them independent contractors now. Now, that's how it is. What are you going to do about it? And the reality is, that's what it is until somebody challenges the categorization. And of course, the difficulty in the real world is that many people who theoretically could challenge that categorization are not as likely to challenge as one might assume. You might say, well, wait a minute. You're being told you're an independent contractor. You just got hurt. Why don't you go file a workers' comp claim? I can't because I'm an independent contractor. Now, wait a minute. I'm not so sure you're an independent contractor. Well, you might be right. But I'm not going to take the trouble to do this. And if I sound like somebody who has these kinds of, I mean, I was a blue collar worker for 15 years, and I worked right next to people and had conversations with them like that about issues of that kind. Maybe maybe better safer than sorry, right? So yeah, this could be happening in the same place, in the same town, in the same state. And you might say, well, wait a minute, there's a big difference between the way California would define employees under some of the novel law that's been developing there, and how the same law might be defined in Missouri. And well, there's a difference, but it doesn't really matter now much, does it? If what the employer is going to say is you're an independent contractor, and sort of by fiat. I'm not saying that's happening. I believe things like that are happening. Just my intuitions tell me that's what's going on. And I think that the problem is, as you know, if the entities that should not be paying for the injury are not paying for the injury, then you're going to have cost shifts. And you're going to notice it because some other structure that wasn't expecting to pay the cost in connection with that injury is now paying the cost in connection with that injury. Now their books are now problematic, and I think that's the difficulty we can find ourselves in.
and that's if they can pay the costs. And let me come back to that, but uh, it strikes me that you mentioned the HR director struggling to understand this, and that's somebody who's probably gone to school and studied and is focused on this area. And nobody that gets hurt at work, sorry, almost nobody that gets hurt at work has ever thought of workers' comp until they get hurt. There's there's a few folks, the union shop steward maybe, my buddy got hurt, but for the most part, we're all sort of blissfully unaware. Um, and I think that's really troublesome. But back to the cost, if they do take what you're mentioning and they go and they litigate to try to get workers' comp, they may wait 2 years going through that system before they find out it is going to be Medicare that's going to pay. And by then, it may be too late to fix what's wrong with the person's body. If we don't render timely medical care, it may not be just about cost. It may be about failure of recovery. So then I've got a broken human being, and the cost to me of that is far greater than the cost of the surgery.
And along those same lines, I was at a conference a few weeks ago in Illinois, and I was speaking with some uh, uh, workers' compensation lawyers. I believe you're familiar with the organization, and they were doing a program jointly with Illinois Workers' Comp Lawyers Association. We had a good group, and we were talking about the gig economy. And one of the things that I thought was interesting is just if you just sort of stepped back, the amount of disagreement in the room about what the gig economy was, how the cases, we had lawyers from Illinois and Missouri primarily, but there were some lawyers from elsewhere. How this would be handled. Now go back to the person who gets hurt, and they're considering, well, maybe I should go look for a lawyer, or maybe I shouldn't. But no matter who I call, I might get a different answer about this problem. And it's a funny thing when that happens broadly enough. One of the upshots is that workers out on the ground, workers who are more aware than people think about some of these things that are going on. They may not understand workers' comp, but what they do know is that the system's answer is no. And they internalize that no, and then which may or may not be accurate in their state. It may have been litigated. It may not have been litigated. It's unclear almost everywhere. And then they say, well, the answer is no, so I'm not even going to file. And then if they're totally disabled for long enough, maybe they become involved with Social Security disability. Maybe they don't, but that cost is going to get transferred somewhere, and that's a big concern of mine too.
And the transfer may just be to them. It may be that they end up with the lost house, the lost cars,
Right,
the
right.
family disruption. Um, what's the answer? You and I have talked before about these alternatives to workers' comp. We've currently got our session just ended, but we had a bill on opt-out here in Florida. Um, I remember years ago there was the Black Car Fund I did some interaction with up in New York. To me, these are sort of alternatives to comp, but would they be alternatives for the gig worker, or are they just another something that could easily be ignored by the employer that wants to avoid them?
Well, I put on my systems hat here, and I sort of step back and take a look at this, and I say, okay, call it what you want. What is the net reality going to be? What's the cash box value of calling it one thing as opposed to another thing, right? Is the worker going to wind up with an adequate amount in his or her pocket, right? What are we actually talking about? And interestingly enough, when you have people who talk about the construct portable benefits, right? Because you hear this term used quite a bit. The idea that, well, even if you are an independent contractor and you're a gig worker, what we're going to do is we're going to create this system of portable benefits. Call it the Black Car Fund, call it what you like, right? We're going to have a way to ensure these in between workers in some way, right? Now, I'm an old Sam Gompers man. When we go back into sort of the union days, nobody remembers who Sam Gompers is anymore. But he's one of the more pragmatic labor folks that I've ever encountered in print. What I want to do is I want to see what's going to work. you know, what is it that's going to work, right? Yes, I know we have this system and this structure, and I teach it to my students, and we know what it is, and so forth. But the problem is if what you're going to deliver from an alternative, whether it's you call it opt out. Now of course, the thing about opt out. Now we can get into our a workers' comp nerdy place. Okay, workers' comp is the quid pro quo for a tort claim. And I've always had problems on constitutional grounds with how you take away comp, which is something that, after all, was signed off on by the highest courts in the land. And I understand how you take that away. You substitute this statutory system that's been approved, and you replace that with some other kind of system where we say, okay, now you as an employer are going to have an opportunity to opt out of the system. Okay, fine. What happens? Because the first thing I start thinking about is, well, why doesn't this worker who no longer has access to workers' comp, why don't they have a tort claim? Right? Let's just go back to first principles. What happened to the tort claim? And it's like, well, maybe that's gone. The other thing I should mention about that, and I don't think it's been it came up, you may recall, in Oklahoma. Oklahoma had an opt-out system. Ultimately, it was declared unconstitutional for some exotic reasons that I won't go into. But I do think that one of the things they discovered, and even the drafters of the bill discovered, is that if it ain't workers' comp, it's an employee benefit and therefore covered by ERISA. So you get these very interesting federal preemption problems that most people are not aware of, and but it creates its own level of complexity. But what this is by way of saying is that everything that we have, we may not think of what we do as being we may think of it as being somewhat chaotic sometimes, right? Like, oh my God, what's going on in my corner of the world? But the reality is that we've been developing this structure since what, 1911, 12, 13. Then we have agencies that come in the 1930s. Then we have agencies that come in the 1960s, federal agencies, I mean. And what you wind up with is this intricate kind of structure that has all kinds of facets to it. And although it can sound like a good idea for anybody in their little facet to sort of pull away, to change it, to modify it, to alter it, the problem is always, wait a minute, what impact is that going to have on other aspects of this crystalline structure that we've set up? And a lot of times people are not really thinking about it. If you want to do opt out, okay, we can conceptually say, well, you call it what you like. What's that going to mean? What's the upshot of that going to mean? I mean, really, what we're doing is we're going back to the Germans in the 1880s and the English in the 1880s and early 20th century, and we're reconceptualizing how we're going to compensate work injury. Right now, I'm game. I'm game. But the problem is that we now have a world which wasn't the world that they had. If we try to do something like that, we're going to bump up alongside these other structures that have been, I don't know if they've been carefully laid in. There's certainly accretions, right? There's certainly these layers of law, of policy that have gathered over time, right? And we're now going to try to make a change in our little corner of the world. Well, maybe you can, but I think at a minimum, what you have to do is be very careful before you do that. Be very careful, and what I've always said to people who have alternative ideas, it's like, well, I'm an old collective bargaining dude, right? Maybe we ought to have a reopener at some point so we can stop, take a deep breath, look around, see if this is working, see if there's some do this very self-consciously at the time you enter into whatever you want to call this, some kind of a new grand bargain. And David, I think that people like us who are self-reflective and thinking about these things very deliberately, I think we're probably going to be caught up to and passed by events, because I just don't see how you can, for example, reindustrialize the country. And is it going to happen? Well, probably not in the way that people think, but something like that is going to happen just because I think the prior structure was not sustainable. I don't think I'm being a radical by saying that, you know. And I think what happens is that now you've got a much different kind of economy, a more robust physical economy where people are more likely to get hurt. And I think that people who go tinkering around at the edges of, let's say, workers' comp, and now you're going to have somebody who's hurt, who can't get a remedy, who doesn't have enough to support himself or herself or the family. You're going to arrive back at the same set of problems that caused us to create a lot of this in the first place.
Well, the intriguing thing about the opt-out they proposed here, and again, it didn't pass, but it was a set of benefits under ERISA, as you described, but the right to sue in tort was restored. And so,
Yeah, you can't do that. So here's what I would say. And it's a good example of what happens at the state level. And by the way, um, one thing you don't really want, I hope nobody's listening that will take offense, but to be an ERISA expert, I don't know if I want that patch on my shirt, but I can tell you that you can't sue employee benefit plans in state tort. It's preempted under Section 514 of ERISA. And it's a good example of how, well, just what we were just talking about. You want to sort of change the structure. That's fine. You can't sue an ERISA employee benefit plan, right? In state law tort, there are cases 30 years old that say that.
but could you still sue the employer for negligence?
No,
Hmm,
no,
intriguing.
you cannot. Now, in Texas, where, as you know, they have the option of going bare, right? If you have an ERISA governed plan, right? You can't sue that ERISA governed plan. But if the employer goes bare, so there's no workers' comp at all, right? Which has been the Texas structure from the beginning. You can sue that employer, and that's really what they mean by going bare.
Hmm.
The employer who doesn't opt into workers' comp is liable in a tort suit. The employer who establishes an ERISA governed alternative benefit plan is sheltered from tort suits, but of course has to pay whatever it's promised as part of its plan. And rapidly you make no friends when you start laying out these options. But I think that's where we are, and brings us back to the gig economy, because every gig worker that we see that we're sort of being allowed to be written out of the structure could be covered any number of ways that we can sort of imagine. Although, again, ERISA depends upon, for its existence, on the existence of employees. There's a series of factors that evaluate the employee relationship under ERISA. So that's complicated in its own right. So you might think, well, I'll get away from this whole question by I'll have gig workers, and then I'll have an ERISA governed plan. No, you won't, because those gig workers, again, may be found not to be employees and therefore not eligible to ERISA's protections.
So as we keep tinkering around the edges, whether it's state legislatures or the federal legislature or the federal regulators or any number of state regulators, we start making these little adjustments, and all we do is further complicate the picture for the injured worker.
Yeah, and it may be inevitable. I mean, I don't discount the possibility that it's inevitable. I mean, for example, one answer, the ERISA preemption answer to ERISA preemption is to simply go in and fix Section 514 of ERISA. There's a really interesting story about how that provision, which has had such an enormous impact on American society, it really was the vehicle that prevented states from experimenting with employee medical plans. They couldn't do it
Hmm.
because ERISA preempted attempts to do that. But the story of the creation, and I only tell this story because it's important to remember that adjustments can be made. So right at the end of the 10-year period within which ERISA was negotiated, really created, at the very last minute, the AFL-CIO and the Chamber of Commerce, as part of the negotiations on the joint negotiations on the combined bill, came out literally of a little room, and I have a whole political history of it by Jim Wooten, who's a law professor up at the University of Buffalo. They came out with sweeping ERISA preemption language because both the union and the Chamber of Commerce were concerned about what, for example, not to pick on any state, what Massachusetts was going to do about, for example, coverage of a mental illness, which was a live issue in Massachusetts, and which neither the union benefit plans nor the employer benefit plans wanted to pay for. But that could change, next month. If you get the right collection of legislators, I don't know if I'd be holding my breath, but if you got them together, you could undo that Section 514 and change the whole environment. But it's also a cautionary tale as to just how complex a lot of this really is, how many strands come together to create this thing that we call labor and employment law. It's why we have a labor and employment center here at St. Louis University School of Law, because there's really no way to have a short conversation about many of these issues.
Yeah, I'm thrown back to the lawyers constantly preach to me about the social safety net, and and I ask them why they call it that. Their excuse is that that's what other people call it. When I hear it, I think of a net being made up of, as you phrased it, strands. And and so if your safety net has broken strings in it, uh, you might want to be careful how hard you land on it,
All right.
because one of those strands fails or two or three of them fail, and you might be in a real problem. Um, so what is the solution for gig workers? Is it one of the things that occurred to me is these silly phones. Every time I take a share car ride, I can see the driver coming on my phone, and they see me coming. So somebody's aware that driver's working at that moment. Couldn't we build a workers' comp system that worked the same way, that turned on workers' comp when the driver was on duty and sort of turns it off when they're not on duty, and we don't have to monitor?
That's another AI project. we
Yeah.
could to look. So what I think the answer is, what I anticipate is going to happen, and I could be completely wrong, but people for long enough, and I have already seen some of this, right? How long is it going to be before a state simply says, that's it, all your independent contractors are covered just like we cover employees for workers' comp? What stops the state from doing that? I mean, if it were the federal government doing it, you'd have some real federalism issues, right? But if my state says, we've got all these gig workers running around, and they're bleeding, and they're overwhelming the emergency room, and we don't, that's it. We've just made a decision as a state, the state of harmony, as I say on my exams. In the state of harmony, we make a decision to just cover independent contractors. What are we going to do then? We're going to go back to the 14th Amendment, and states will be arguing about interference with their property rights. So to me, whether it's something like that, or maybe it's some other kind of state structure where you simply you do some kind of a surcharge. Somebody's going to pay for the cost of those injuries, or nobody will. And of
Yeah.
course, if nobody does, then as you point out rightly, that falls on the worker, and we're right back where we were in 1910 potentially.
And neither one of those answers is a relatively good one. Falling on the worker or falling into chaos. Uh, and I've had this problem. You just reminded me, it's not just the independent contractors. If a state were to do it, I've questioned many times, why doesn't some state say all employees are covered? None of this three or more employees. All employers are covered. And that would take a huge chunk out of the uninsured, uncovered marketplace. But you never hear that discussed.
Yeah. Well, one of the advantages you and I have in knowing something about the evolution of workers' compensation is that we understand that it's possible to do these things. Like, that once we know what the problem is, we've got a certain number of uncovered workers. I mean, there's the question of rights, right, which is a different kind of question. There's the question of coverage, right? Just as a policy matter, who are we going to cover? And once you've identified what the problem is, you have policy tools available to you. And I mean, obviously, we know things. Some of the crudest ones, just taxes and so forth. But there are any number of others, right? Engineering workplaces in a certain way. I remember I was in Boise, Idaho, in another lifetime, looking at the way that their buses ran through the middle of Boise. And at the time, at this point in time, probably 10 years ago, they had these kind of concrete roadways within the city. So it was almost like a combination of a train and a bus. So it was a hardened area where the bus traveled. And I thought to myself, okay, so some people are not going to enjoy running into that concrete barrier if they're sitting in the bus. But on the other hand, nothing's running into your bus, right? That's not going to happen, right? I think as important as anything is having a policy desire. Like, what do you want to do? My dad, going many years back, I grew up in a house where my dad was a Republican, my mom was a Democrat, and she was a coal miner's daughter, right? And so she suffered no fools, right? And my dad would walk into these traps. I don't know where he'd be ideologically nowadays, were he alive, but he would walk into these traps. But the thing in my household was that everybody agreed about really key points, like, okay, like, we can't get people killed, right?
Yeah.
If we can avoid that. We can't cause businesses so much money that they go out of business, right? We have to have some economic activity. We can't, there are a whole series of things. And the problem, of course, is as this gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and everybody siphons off into their own, they go into their own silos, and
Yeah.
they can't have conversations that are outside of the silos. We lose a degree of flexibility. We're no longer nimble. When I was one of my first workers' comp jobs right out of law school was in Maine, and I would talk to people who had been involved in Maine workers' compensation back in the 60s. And back in those days, Republicans and Democrats could sit down and basically identify at least where they disagreed, find regions of agreement, right? Agree on what they could agree on, at least be clear about what they disagreed on, then and you had a whole conversation, right? And everything that I see, that I teach, traditional labor law, right? Traditional labor law is about a negotiation, right? I mean, it's like we've got to sit down, we've got to talk, we got to sort out our differences. We have to see what we agree on, what we don't agree on, see if there's some way that we can at least move towards some place that we agree on. All those kinds of things. I fear that's what's being lost at the moment.
And I think it's I personally think it's deeper than that. I think we used to be able to compartmentalize like you're describing, and now I see reactions across the country where a comp bill is being held hostage over some tax bill or over some budget item, and it's not being looked at on its merits. It's being sort of part of a grand puzzle. And
Yeah,
then
well,
there,
here's a concept in labor law, David. You know, in labor law, we there's a part of what we do is to analyze the bargaining that's going on, right? If we bargain, you're going to be better off than you were before. But there's a concept called bad faith bargaining,
yeah.
right? There's a concept that says, okay, now what's going on is that you're breaking down the bargaining process. We can't even get to having a discussion about it. And for many years, the problem that the government had, just as a theoretical matter, is how negotiation process without pressuring illegitimately one side or the other in terms of what the substance of a proposal should be, right? And what I heard you just say, I think, is like we can't even like we're not, but we can't even get to that point because as you said, there's a tax bill. Like we can't have a negotiation that is focused, right? Because we have this broader chess match going on in which I must always win and you must always lose, and therefore we wind up doing nothing.
Well, that and I don't know, maybe things weren't that great in the good old days. I feel like they were, but I think we've got just more and more problems. There's more and more issues on the table. And as we face those variety of challenges, I don't know. I just feel like we're being subsumed. I promised you we'd get off by the top of the hour because you've got uh, other processes to keep up with. I know it's probably finals week for you too, and so I really
It is,
appreciate,
yeah.
yeah, I appreciate you taking the time. Final thoughts. How would we solve this, or do you have any suggestions how we would start to solve this or begin a conversation? Where do we go?
Well, I think you cannot have a world in that is like the one you were describing, where you have 10 different employee definitions in a state. That's unacceptable. It's not sustainable. And I really believe a lot of what's pushing the movement towards gig is the complexity of employee definitions. I don't even very often I just think that people aren't really even thinking about, well, how bad is that restatement 220? That's not the point. The point is we don't know who anybody is. And so I think a modest proposal would be to figure out some kind of a nationally agreed upon employee definition, right? And that's going to apply everywhere. Now you're still going to have disagreement within the analysis. As I tell my students, you're going to be writing for a long time if I'm testing you on this issue because the tough cases are going to have factors that point in different ways. But at least we would know what the argument is. So that's something I think that we could really do. I think you could even get some nonpartisan buy-in with things along those lines. And I think what may push that is this reindustrialization, because I see this as you get old enough. I know you may not be old enough. You may not be old enough, but I feel old enough, and that I can start saying this looks like a major development. If you start having supply chains coming back to the U.S. I remember when they were leaving the 1980s when I was a blue collar kid, out working jobs, and all those jobs were going away. Lots of Bruce Springsteen songs were written.
Mhm.
Well, if that's really what's happening, if we now have a situation where you're going to have a long period of tariffs and maybe reindustrialization in some areas and maybe not in other areas, a period of reconfiguration, it seems to me that that would be an ideal time to do something along these lines. So at least we can inject some rationality into this question. Now, if on the other hand, the objective that some race to the bottom actors, that's another way to put it, if their objective is to not pay for the cost of injury, right, then we're going to have a problem, because there are going to be people injured in an industrial economy, and we're going to have to figure out what to do about them. Of course, the irony is that, if you're not careful, right, you could be pushing a federal structure that you may be, philosophically opposed to, because you leave the national government in a position where there's nothing else that it can do, at least in the short term. But let's get a definition. That might be a good way. And I teach my students, the default I teach is the restatement second, section 222 of agency, allowing for California as the outlier, and away we go, right? That's that. Otherwise, we'd have no way to get through that section of the course.
Yeah, and California is never going to come join us in the restatement, so that just is what it is. I can't thank you enough for taking the time. Good luck with the rest of finals week and wrapping up. And I'm going to take some of this to heart and maybe get to doing some writing and be back in touch with you. Maybe we'll get back together in a Zoom like this again next fall and talk again.
I look forward to it, Dave. Thanks
All
for
right.
having me.
No, thanks for being here. Be well and take care, okay?
Thank you. You too.